I'll spare you the full backstory of Dragon Quest and its older American counterpart Dragon Warrior, though for the subject of this video, I will need to tackle a few of the releases, and more importantly re-releases, that were the building blocks for this video's subject. Dragon Quest 1, 2, and 3 were all Famicom classics of the 1980s, and then see American NES releases later on with their own improvements like more detailed graphics, animation, and quality of life improvements, as well as these extra introductory cutscenes that gave us more backstory and, well, just some pure spectacle. I can't imagine playing Dragon Quest 3 without seeing this volcano fight. Oh wait, I can, because I played the Switch version before. During the 1990s, Japan saw Dragon Quest 5 and 6 released for the Super Famicom, and as you'd expect, more gameplay refinements were made between those sequels. But of most importance is that during the 3-year gulf between Dragon Quest 5 and 6, we saw a Super Famicom remake of Dragon Quest 1 and 2. It was a single cartridge with both games, since one is such a small game. But that was such a great deal! Though because of the time it was made, it was based off Dragon Quest V, with its specific visuals and mechanics. Among other things incorporated, it had a more fleshed out introductory cutscene to Dragon Quest II, based off a North American NES release. After Dragon Quest VI, when the Super Famicom was winding down, Japan saw the much anticipated 16-bit remake of Dragon Quest III. Not only did this add refinements from the many sequels since it was built on the richer base of Dragon Quest VI, it saw lots of improvements, both subtle and obvious. And obviously it had the cool American volcano fight. Anyway, North America saw none of this, because NX was winding down in that market. However, when NX rebirthed itself in North America years later, it was just in time for lots of great Dragon Warrior games, including the Game Boy releases of the first 3 games. Yeah, the Game Boy got remakes of the remakes. That is such a cool thing. I had to mention all that because of the important lineage here. Dragon Warrior 3 for Game Boy Color is based on Dragon Quest 3 for Super Famicom, which was built on Dragon Quest 6 for Super Famicom, and this whole thing is a remake of Dragon Quest 3 for Famicom, with inclusions from Dragon Quest 3 for NES. That being said, this Super Famicom remake was crunched down because of its itty-bitty Game Boy specs, and it's super zoomed in, so this isn't an ideal way to play the game, unless you're me. Just to cover the basics, Dragon Warrior 1 and 2 for Game Boy Color are once again a cartridge with 2 games, and it's a black cartridge, so it'll work on a regular Game Boy or even Super Game Boy, and it did an amazing job squeezing those games onto that system. But for Dragon Warrior 3, with its much larger scale, and Foundation being a late Super Famicom release, this beauty is not Super Game Boy compatible, unfortunately. We have one of those Game Boy Color cartridges that wrings out as much power as it can from the aging brick. And the enjoyment starts even before you play the game itself, because for the first time the box art actually has Toriyama's art on it in North America. This time it's his 90s rendition of the third game's hero. This is such a breath of fresh air after the NES games abandoned that art for something more generic, and the previous Game Boy Color games abandoned it for these ugly 3D monstrosities I kind of love. This was such a selling feature that the back of the box even highlights that this is Toriyama's art, recognizable from Dragon Ball Z. While this is a bit silly, it does highlight the growing awareness of anime at the time, and it was something that could finally be marketable to Americans. They found a new way to make people buy stuff. Oh, and this game is compatible with Game Boy Advance. That should highlight how late a release this was. Maybe some of the sheer technical impressiveness here fall apart when you remember the Game Boy Advance was running circles around it, but nah. To me, the fact that this even runs on Game Boy Color is worth celebrating. It's a spectacle to see this game run, and it does it about as flawlessly as you could imagine given the hardware, though it is not without compromises. Though given the fact that American players at the time had only played the NES version, some of those compromises wouldn't even be noticeable. This is a downgraded remake of another remake, with a visual style that is neither that of the 8-bit or 16-bit predecessors. in some very specific ways, is oddly worse than the original, most notably the limited colour palette, which makes everyone be pure white, which is preferable to the flesh swords we had in the earlier remake. Though in most areas, this is a middle ground between the two previous versions, since this has much more detail than the NES version. The environments especially. This is beautiful. No wonder this wasn't compatible with the regular Game Boy. Look, it even has animations for things like the lit candles, and we get the dramatic door animations, plus actual battle animations that are wonderful and varied. And just on the basics that you see all the time, the look this game has, it just pops. Well, it does if you're not playing on an original Game Boy Color screen, those things are very hard to see. But the characters here are all basic white, black, and a single extra color to accent them, and they stand out incredibly well against the detailed environments. Also, our sword doesn't bend anymore, which I personally prefer. I'll go into the wide variety of differences in a bit, but first I need to talk about the game itself. Wait, I lied. I need to explain one more thing, sorry, I'm really sorry. Dragon Warrior 1 saw us on the continent of Alefgard, and we were descendants of a legendary hero named either Erdrick or Loto in Japanese. Because of the very limited text space on the Game Boy remakes, this was turned into Loto internationally. The same thing happened with Dragon Warrior 2, except it was on the entire world that Alefgard entailed, and we played with descendants of the descendant of before, but it was still furthering the Loto legacy. But Dragon Warrior 3 threw us a curveball. For the first time in the series, we're without the story of Loto to prop us up. Instead, we're the child of Ortega, a cool dude who fought on a volcano, and he left home when our character was still a young child. This was because he was tasked with defeating the great evil that threatened the world. But many years have passed and no progress has been made. Ortega is assumed dead, and the world still needs saving from the Demon King Baramus. But as a 16-year-old child, obviously we're the best choice for savior of the world, so do what your skilled father couldn't and save everyone. The heroes are usually blank slates, but here we have fun. We start the game by selecting our gender, and we do a personality quiz where the game calls me out and says that I'm vain. We're initially without a party, but that is rectified in a way that most games in the series wouldn't attempt. Instead of actually finding other characters and having them join us, here we go to the building where adventurers are, Ruida's Tavern, and we create our own party members out of thin air. It's a fun way to incorporate your friends or people you have parasocial relationships with. Here we get the choices of warrior, fighter, mage, cleric, dealers, jesters, and thieves who were first introduced with the Super Famicom remake, meaning American audiences were first introduced to them here. All the classes serve a purpose, even though some are wiser choices than others. For example, the jesters are basically useless, and the game tells you not to start with them. So obviously I started the game with Fighter Josh, Jester Heil, and Cleric Jem. And the reason I picked those people in particular is because we have a super restrictive 4-letter limit for character names. This was understandable for the Japanese versions, considering how their language works, and the length of most names. But it is a legitimate weakness here. Hope you don't mind shortening names, or that you know a lot of people with 3 or 4 letter names. And I want to make it clear, I'm not attacking the hard work the localizers had to do here. This game is already pushing its limits. I can't imagine that they could have done much to change this. It is just a small compromise worth noting. Now you see why they turned Erdrick into Loto, and in lieu of using the full names of things like weapons or equipment, Icon is used instead. These icons were something Nob Ogasawara had to fight for, because of the tight text boxes and their limits. It's a really fun compromise that gives this game some of its unmistakable charm. The game was way ahead of the curve by using so many emoticons. Nob specified he also had to change the font table and make custom characters that were letter and apostrophe combinations. Basically this was done to save room. It was that dire. All this information I gathered from the Dragon's Den Slime Time podcast, where they interviewed Nob himself. He also reiterated some of this when he commented on my Blue Sky post, and that made me happy. Knob's localization here deserves a lot of credit for generally sticking closer to the original text than what the previous NES American release saw. On a whole, this is a more faithful script. And also on that note, since I don't know when else I'll get to talk about this, I'll just mention that this game actually uses crosses in its churches, which is just notable because the older American releases use stars, and the newer releases use these weird cross variants which would make crucifixion a lot more excruciating. And on to something lighter, this budding group of adventurers is going to make a legacy no one will forget. And it starts with very humble beginnings. But here we see the game's penchant for verticality and a degree of spatial awareness. We start the game by taking an underground path to reach a small island that's inaccessible by land. And then we climb a giant tower, which comes complete with the ability to just walk off the edge and fall to the ground below. Consequence-free, of course. Much like what most of this game offers, it's all very standard, but in the context of when the original Famicom game released, it marks excellent craft work. Chunsoft had refined this formula over the years. And even after all this time and multiple re-releases, the great foundation here hasn't weakened a bit. It's just that it shines less spectacularly now, because the world around it has changed. This game is very standard and boilerplate, and it's so familiar that the game will feel nostalgic even if you've never played it before. This was the template for countless games going forward. Sure, there were console RPGs long before this, including the impossible to ignore Dragon Quest 1 and 2, and something no one else has ever heard of called Final Fantasy? But it's impossible to deny the footprint Dragon Quest 3 initially left. But it does leave this game feeling quaint. Though it is easy to ignore that, because what Dragon Warrior 3 lacks in uniqueness, it more than makes up for in its execution. This is bar none the best game in the series when it comes to feeling like an open adventure. Some games have more impressive stories, or have mechanics I find richer, but none of them play or feel quite like this. This whole opening is on what I like to call Tutorial Island. It's basically a microcosm of what to expect. We have a starting town, a nearby dungeon that incorporates caves and tower themes. Then it's onto another town, which leads to one more dungeon before you can escape into the wider world. This isn't to dismiss the quality of it, but on this relatively small landmass, you're funneled on where to go and you shouldn't get lost. It helps new players come to terms with what Dragon Warrior 3 asks of you, while not feeling like a meandering slog to returning players. This game is brisk, and this is what the game will continue to be, just on a much smaller scale here. We also have our mum here to heal us for free if we ever warp wing back home. And this series' iconic and relatively generous way of never letting you lose progress even after your entire party falls in battle will save these beginner players from too much heartache. Wiping only results in losing half your money, which is not a big loss at all this early on, and it's something that can be circumvented with the bank that this starting town has. Interestingly, this is one of those changes from the original release that every remake has incorporated. The banks in the initial releases were used for storing items since you had a very limited inventory, but thanks to this using Dragon Quest VI Skeleton, and that game adding a limitless backpack, that means that we get infinite space here too. While this means the bank has been demoted into just a place to store money instead of complete storage of anything, it helps remove much of the tedium or micromanaging you'd have earlier on. Players no longer have to decide if it's worth keeping items in their bag, everything can stay here. Though characters have specific limited storage for anything they want to use in battle. On the fascinating topic of inventory, the thing I'm sure you all came here to hear about, Dragon Warrior 3 on Game Boy Color manages to speed up things even more by having a menu command to put all unequipped items in the bag, and we get another function that lets us sort the bag by either type or alphabetically. Those functions probably shaved valuable hours off the total time I've sunk across this game in my entire life. And for you, the kind of person that doesn't care about organizing everything, it could save minutes of your life. Now to get back to the game part of the game, once we leave Tutorial Island, we wind up somewhere way less forgiving. Europe. Specifically, Romaly. This castle town is important because not only does it give us an area to gamble, in this case on the automated monster fights, which is a feature I've sunk too much time into, basically cockfighting but less cruel I think, and I've even maxed out the gold counter with this because I put too much time into it. But this gives us something even more important I think. A new place to save the game. You see, in the first few games of the series, you could only save by talking to the monarch at the castle. It was a cute way to incorporate the game's theming into saving, even if it wasn't the most convenient thing in the world. This game continues that, but thanks to this being a portable release, an extra feature was mercifully added. Permanent saves are still only done at castle towns by talking to whoever is in charge, but at any time, you can bring up a button to do a temporary save. This means players who have to stop playing because of their schedule, or because the Game Boy needs some more AA's, they can immediately call it quits without having to leave their current in-game location. This is specifically a temporary save, however, so you can't use it to cheat the system. What that means is the game will stop once it's temporary saved, and when you next boot up the game, you're asked if you want to resume that temp save. Once you do that, that specific save is deleted, and any resets would go back to the last permanent castle save. It's meant for when you take breaks, not for when you want to reattempt something over and over. Also, on the subject of this game supports 3 save slots, which likely isn't a big deal to anyone playing this game now, but this would have been a godsend to players back in the day who shared this cartridge with their entire family. 3 people could share the cartridge without overwriting each other's saves, and that's probably the ideal way to play this game because of a feature I'll talk about much later. Anyway, Romaly is a nice introduction to the game's theme of having to travel areas based on real-world locations, though it is slightly more subtle here than it is in later Dragon Quest games, because in those, every character talks in exaggerated accents. Not that I'm complaining, I'm personally a fan of that style. Dragon Warrior 3 is a product of the much older localization choices, which were a lot more no-nonsense, which is some people's preference. For example, instead of spells like Kabuff, Whoosh, and Kafrizzle, it's Increase, Infernus, and Blazemost. But one thing that is full of nonsense here is the king. He wants to give it up and enjoy a normal life of gambling on monsters like we all do. So after you help him, you get to become the new leader. It's a small gag where you walk around and do nothing, but I'm bringing it up because the Game Boy version still managed to include a modified sprite of the hero, instead of just turning them into a different sprite. I only bring that up because the Switch version didn't get that memo. Whoops. The new role of the Monarch here also won't let us pick up items off the ground anymore, because they're of no use to someone in our position. It's a dedication to the joke, and I love it, because the average player of this game will be pressing buttons all the time to pick up invisible items. These are almost exclusively tiny medals, an entirely optional goodie that the series sometimes love to have. Collect a bunch of these usually impossible to see things, and you can trade them in for special equipment. In the game's defense, a lot of the time they're in suspicious tiles, or areas that seem like obvious locations to put one. But on the other hand, I've never even come close to finding most of them, and after looking at some guides, some of these are just devious. Anyway, they're optional, and no one besides the kind of person who would want to write guides about this game, or brag to strangers, would ever try to find too many of these. So don't worry about them. We have a bigger metal threat to worry about later. Anyway, after we leave the town with the king who has given up, we explore more of Europe on foot, and something inescapable needs to be mentioned. Day and night cycles. These were introduced in the Famicom game's original release, and it's such a cool novelty that has a minimal effect on the game itself, but look at it, it's just really cool, and it's got small enough ramifications that you can say it's justified here and isn't just something that's cool. These transition over the course of steps through the map, and it's not in any way tied to our real-world clocks. The cycles here are especially cool on Game Boy Color, because once again, this is something the system shouldn't be attempting. We have so many palettes here for switching between day and night, as well as an even darker true night on top of that. How was this game made? It shouldn't work on this. And while I'm sucking up the game's impressiveness, I just want to get into the presentation of battles. Here, every enemy has animations for when they attack. This is a feature lifted directly from the Super Famicom version. Though given that this is the Game Boy, we weren't able to keep the battle backgrounds anymore, which is unfortunate, but very easy to forgive. Game Boy Dragon Warrior 1 had those, but I was helped by that just being single enemies at a time. The other game on the same cartridge wasn't able to include those, and this one-ups that by also bringing in animations which were entirely absent from the previous Game Boy releases. Not having backgrounds doesn't lessen the impact at all, because not only do their attacks cross into the foreground and get over our HUD, the HUD shakes whenever an enemy attack lands. It just really feels like you're in the combat here to the best of the Game Boy's capabilities, let's not get carried away. Our attacks, especially all the powerful spells, are phenomenal to see in action. And cause there's more to battle than how pretty it is, this remake improves over the NES original by automatically selecting a new target whenever a party member has to attack one that has already been defeated. The old game was one of those ones where you attack thin air and wasted an action. This is a huge upgrade. Outside of combat, while traveling the world, we'll stumble upon towns in need of saving, and they all feel like substantial mini-adventures we just come across. This is a game all about the diversions. The ultimate goal of defeating Baramos is just something that we're building up to. It's never in the background because it always looms over us, but it's not what we're focused on most of the time. This is all about the smaller scale stuff that connects together, and it's all perfectly justified because we are rewarded important items that we need to even reach the Demon King. The gatekeeping starts off with keys. There are a bunch of doors that are locked, so help people and be rewarded with 3 increasingly powerful keys. And thanks to these doors sticking out and annoying you early on, combined with the ability to fast travel between cities, it means you're able to go back and find goodies that are only there for diligent players who remember doors that were previously locked and inaccessible. After some more meandering, we'll get to a town named Noannuals, where everyone is asleep. Regardless of the time of day, this town is essentially frozen with people just standing there, unmoving. It's eerie. And this is thanks to the nearby town of Elvenham, which is not surprisingly filled with elves. The Elfin Charge has frozen every one of Noannuals for supposedly kidnapping her daughter. Unbeknownst to her, her daughter and a human man fell in love. They knew they couldn't be together, so the 2 young lovers ended their lives together. It's a classic depressing love story. The Dragon Quest series as a whole loves to be these uplifting, cheerful games. Look, any game with these little slimes can't be sad. But these writers always love putting in little gut punches that darken the mood. Dragon Warrior 3 is no exception. I should be sad, but I can't because the music is bopping. On that note, while it's very subjective, the Game Boy Color soundtrack is my personal favourite way to listen to this game's music. I know I meant to say the symphonic scores are, but no, give me those Game Boy bleeps and bloops any day. After discovering what really happened with the elf daughter, you're given a powder to awaken the people of the sleepy town, and you find out they've been frozen for many years. None of them are aware that they essentially skipped ahead in time, and they all talk about how the hero Ortega was here yesterday, and how he was trying to find the same keys we are. I love this whole aspect of the story, because throughout the travels, we'll find many people who remember our hero's father, and we're basically doing the same journey he did all those years ago. It just feels like we're following in his footsteps. Immediately after this, we leave Europe and travel to the nighttime entertainment town of Ashalam, located in the Arabian Desert, and then it's on to the town of Isis and the Great Pyramid dungeon near it. I said this release was a little more subtle with these locations, but it's still not subtle, it's just a comparative thing. At night, when you're in Isis, you can talk to a cat who reveals himself to be a servant of Baramus, and they actively mock you. This one cat is not a good boy or girl, I'm sorry, I don't make the rules. I gotta love how in the pyramid itself, the designers clearly had fun with it. Not only is it filled with traps, including mimic treasure chests, but a bunch of irregular treasure chests here open and then you find there's nothing in them. They're completely empty. This is obviously because of lots of grave robbing, since this is meant to be an Egyptian pyramid. Completing this desert journey brings us to the European coastal kingdom of Portoga. The MacGuffin that they need the hero to get for them is an exotic spice known as pepper. This diversion is the most important one, however, because once we do it, we're rewarded with a boat, which dramatically changes the rest of the game. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so we need to travel on land to reach Baharata in the east. And of course, once we set foot there, we're given another quest to be completed, this time revolving around people kidnapped by some bandits. And en route to fixing that, we find the Dharma Shrine, a location of great importance, though it is largely inaccessible at this time. You see, once your party member reaches level 20, you can class change them. Don't go overboard, but it is important to do this if you want to maximize the potential of all the allies you brought with you. And more importantly, you get different sprites. Now obviously we fix the kidnapping situation and bring back Pepper, and that turns Dragon Warrior 3 into Dragon Warrior 3. This whole section I've been painstakingly describing is almost a prologue to what the game is truly about. It's been a largely linear quest, but with the boat, the entire world becomes our oyster. Our quest is now to get 6 orbs from all over the world, so go find them, in any order. This is why Dragon Warrior 3 feels like an adventure. You have no guidance, just explore. No one can tell me what to do. I'm just going to monster gamble even more and spend all my tickets on the Parcheesi boards, which are also addictive. There is so much being said by characters here, and there are little hints or outright explanations of where you should be going, so you won't ever get lost. It's just the order in which you do events is entirely up to you. But all these little dialogue lines can be too much to remember, so thankfully the game gives you the ability to commit dialogue that you just read to memory. This can be recalled at any time, which is super important. Or if you want to waste it, you can just use it on all the horses you meet and recall their neighs and whinnies. The open ocean will take us to many great areas, which in my recent playthrough, I have discovered in the specific order of Zipangu, a town where kids point at you and call you a foreigner, and your goal is to save them from Orochi, a demon that has been demanding sacrifices. Once again, lots of people have died here, and it straddles the line of being sad in this upbeat, cheerful game. Lancel. Much like real life, it's the one town in all of Australia, and it's the access point to the test of courage that the hero needs to complete. It's also home to a powder that makes you invisible. Why would you ever need that? More. A town in the hinterlands where everyone recognizes you as Pokapa, a traveller that we learn is our father. Once again, following in his footsteps, and here we even get his iconic horned helmet. A town on the eastern North American continent that you build up from scratch. Bring a merchant with you, dump them here, and they will turn this tiny area into a bustling city of commerce. It'll be named after whichever merchant you brought here, so welcome to Camberg. In real life, Cam helps me out with this video's thumbnail, but in this game, he's a greedy tyrant, which eventually leads to his own imprisonment after a revolution. How could you, Cam? Tedanki, a completely destroyed village in Africa where the people here talk to you and say that they are scared of a demon lord who is right nearby. And I have to give special praise to this town for its atmosphere. It feels truly desolate, even on this brick of a system. The grass is a browner shade here than any other location, which uses the more vibrant green you constantly see. Edinburgh, a castle in Britain that won't let you in, so you have to be invisible. Sioux, a village by the great rivers of North America, not a lake, rivers. As a very white person, I won't comment on this beyond saying it's obvious what they're going for, since everyone speaks in a slightly broken English, there are no paved paths, and we see lots of brown headbands. It is definitely part of this game. Oh, and they also sell mohawk wigs. Oh no, I don't want to talk about that. The game gets way worse in this aspect with all the shaman enemies and their variants that we see across America and Africa, and that's not good. Speaking of things that aren't good, we have Seminole, a South American castle town which used to be ruled by this kind king, who has suddenly become a tyrant that kills anyone who doesn't live up to his standards. We even see a funeral here complete with crying children. But like all the other times this game pulls on our heartstrings, it never gets too sad, because I can keep betting on all the monster fighting, and I'm making so much money here, take that you idiots! This is pretty dramatic for a game that is so upbeat, and about fighting cute little monsters with your party, which includes a clown that constantly messes up. But yeah, during this journey, my team went across a few different class changes. Josh became a thief, so I could use his helpful thief commands, and also I wanted the whole team to be blue, because Hyle and Jem became sages. Over the course of the run, I'd class change back Josh to a fighter, and then post-game I'd make the two sages be two different thieves. Everyone got to be a thief except the hero. There is a downside to this that I'll complain about later. Even the thieves have a cool, exciting, and newish class. Back onto the journey, I explored South America's Pirate Cove, which is a place you shouldn't set foot in. It's dangerous. Once you actually go there though, they're a pretty friendly bunch that know about you through reputation. And we have some smaller areas that are less easy to parallel to real-world locations, like the ghost ship, which once again is sad because lovers perished. But the more sad thing about this is the Gameboy Color struggles to make the music here sound good. The whole exploration part of the game is all in service to gather the 6 orbs I mentioned earlier, and then we fly to the South Pole named Liam Land, which will result in the birth of the great phoenix Ramia. With this, we can fly over everything and finally make it to the locations that were inaccessible, thanks to mountains. One of which is a really nice diversion that we'll get more use out of later. It's a mysterious castle where this queen dragon will lay an egg, which I'm sure will never come back into the series. Oh yeah, and the real reason Josh is dressed in a fursuit is because he got a plush suit costume, and that actually changes the sprite. That's really cool. It's here that I have to put up some kind of spoiler warning. I'm sure most of you don't care, and to people with even a bit of familiarity with the series, the following that I'm going to say is pretty common knowledge. That being said, I want to get into everything about this game. I love this game, and I don't want to ruin it for people that want to play this game and go in as blindly as they can. So leave now, next video is Digimon or something, I don't know. For the climax of Dragon Warrior 3, the Phoenix can take us up to Baramersa's castle, right by the destroyed town that we visited much earlier. And this feels like a true endgame finale. The castle is all twisted and wrong, the pathways are nonsensical, and it tries to trip you up, though it does it without angering you like the end of Dragon Warrior 2. But once you make it through, you'll see the Demon King himself, and he looks a lot like Piano. This fight is spectacular, and best of all, on the Game Boy Color version, they even fixed an exploit so this fight is a bit tougher than it was on the other releases. So I can say this is better than the Super Famicom release. Yeah, I'm sure someone agrees with me. Baramersa's animations are especially impressive here. I can't get enough of him. This battle is, for lack of a better word, and I'm sorry for saying it, epic. But after such a climactic battle, or in my case, like 3 climactic battle attempts, we finally defeat the Demon Lord and bring peace to the land. It's such a wonderful feeling. Everyone at home loves our hero, and the king even gives us a special ceremony complete with trumpets playing the series theme. And in one of the best pull the rug from under you moments, this fanfare is interrupted by Zoma, the true big bad. He's a giant hulking monstrosity whose introduction darkens the room, kills people, and causes earthquakes. He reveals that Baramos was just one of his disciples, and he rules what is referred to as the Dark World. Well, there goes the celebrations. This news has made the king unable to talk anymore. He won't respond, and it's such a fantastic touch. So to save the game, you now have to talk to his assistant. But it's up to this group of adventurers to venture into the Dark World and take care of Zoma. Thankfully, there is an easy way to do this. Right by the castle where we slayed Baramos, a pit that was previously inaccessible is available to us now. And once we fall into it, we reach a world of perpetual darkness. While we're here, the day-night cycle no longer happens because of Zoma's rule. But that's still the second most interesting thing about the Dark World, because we find out quickly that this world is Alefgard, the continent of Dragon Warrior 1, which also appeared in a minor form in Dragon Warrior 2. To put this into perspective for the millennials listening, this was basically the same moment you had when you played Pokemon Gold or Silver, and after you beat the game, you actually went to Kanto. Or to put this into perspective for the Zoomers, this is basically the same moment you had when you played Pokemon Heart Gold or Soul Silver, and after you beat the game, you went back to Kanto. But this was a huge moment for the 1980s Japanese children that were playing this game, and this was a big deal to the few hundred Americans that also played the Dragon Warrior games in the 90s. This is such a nostalgic feeling that can only be diminished if you're a weirdo like me and first played Dragon Quest III before ever touching 1 or 2. Don't do that. Having these same towns be revisited across 2 different games really highlights just how much more impressive the art here is on Game Boy Color compared to the original black cartridge, which had to be made for the Game Boy's original specs. There are so many differences here compared to the first game's rendition of Alefgard. And it's not just visuals. For example, the tunnel linking the 2 landmasses on the east isn't built yet, though if you do go there via the north, you can see construction workers creating it. Some other major hints of when this is set is that the town of Garenham isn't here yet either, it's just a single house. And the coolest change is that the desert town of Dondora is actually still here. The reason why this is important is because in Dragon Warrior 1, this town was already desolate. We only knew of it because of what we heard, but now we can see what the town was like when it was still alive. There's lots of winks and nudges here, and I can't get enough of them. Like the fortress city of Mikado is now working on a way to summon a golem as its protector, something that we'll have to destroy in the first game. Frankly, while it's almost too coincidental that all these important moments, as well as another one I'll get to much later, are all happening at the same time, it's just really great to see that the developers had as much fun as they could with this. It is fan service at the end of the day, but it doesn't feel out of place. It's at its best here. So for the rest of the game, you'll be doing the bridged version of your quest from the first game. Start near the castle of Tantegel, and make it to the castle that was previously the Draco Lord's and is now occupied by Zoma. Or from the timeline's perspective, is currently occupied by Zoma, but will eventually be home to the Draco Lord. Also, that egg that you saw the Queen Dragon lay earlier is almost certainly the Draco Lord. If only our hero had the foresight to abort that. Due to Zoma's castle being inaccessible by land, and we don't have a phoenix down here either, we have to gather all sorts of MacGuffins to form the bridge. Like I said earlier, this is basically the first game again. But thanks to new mechanics, a slightly different design of Alefgard, and this being all endgame enemies, this doesn't feel like a boring retread. This feels substantial even if it's using the existing formula. Once we make it to Zoma's castle, we see the hero's father, Ortega, is still alive. Throughout this whole Dark World section, NPCs have alluded to him being alive, but here we see proof of it. The reason he took a sweet time is because he lost his memories when he arrived in the Dark World all those years ago. It's tragic, but we can still see that he is doing what he can to defeat the evil. I have no idea how he got to this castle without doing the same fetch quest we had to, but he also fought on top of that volcano, so I suspect he has the ability to bypass obstacles like this. His final moments are captured on screen excellently, and as we see a non-playable fight between him and one of Zoma's minions, the framing is just perfect. This isn't first person, it's us watching this man try and fail, only for us to regain control just in time to run up to him and hear his last words. He says he's losing consciousness and he can no longer see or hear. With that, he lets out, "I am Ortega of Allion. I have remembered now. If you were to visit Allion, find Freeze who lives there, and pass this message on from Ortega. I have failed to bring peace. Forgive me, your wretched father." And then he fades out of existence, probably because he's gone to the next dimension. This is still a mostly upbeat adventuring game, but as I've said so many times, it sprinkles sadness, and this one reigns above them all to me, because it's so personal. Even though we are playing a blank slate, leading a party of even blanker slates, this manages to hit harder than it probably deserved to. All game, we've been following in Ortega's footsteps, both literally in the geography we've travelled, but more importantly, the journey from a rookie to the person who defeated Baramus and is en route to fighting Zoma. It is such a shame Ortega couldn't live long enough to see his only child one more time. But now it's on. We make it to Zoma. We see him once again tower over us with this great scene that really emphasizes how tall he is compared to us. And after he kills us, and then we come back after continuously fighting Metabals until we level up enough, we go back in for round 2, we save Alefgard, and restore the light to this continent. We've done it for real this time. The King of Tentacle thanks us. He bestows a title for this hero, one that really cements their importance. The hero has now been dubbed Loto. So yeah, it turns out Loto, the hero in both Dragon Warrior 1 and 2, was this person. The character's descendants will be heroes in their own right, trying to live up to this legacy. I'm not sure how much of a twist this was meant to be, since there's lots of hints early on about the time period, and Ortega's hat looks just like the weird horned helmet of Dragon Warrior 1. Plus the NES manual for Dragon Warrior 1 even states Alefgard was cloaked in darkness until the brave hero Erdrick brought light to the land. I'm sure lots of kids were shocked by this back in the day, kids are shocked by everything. But regardless of the twistiness of it, this is such a satisfying ending, and it really makes this trilogy of games feel complete. And it improves the first 2 games just by being associated with this big hitter. We're given a credit sequence, which includes the game's logo, and it takes full advantage of the color range afforded to it by the Gameboy Color, and I have no idea how they made this look so smooth. Look at it! Once that's completed, we're told the story continues in Dragon Warrior 1 and 2, which serves as a great excuse to boot up those games again. Unfortunately, they weren't yet aware of Caravan Heart, so it really is just continued in those 2 games. Caravan Heart's a great game, I'm sick of hearing it isn't. But I guess if we included that, we'd also have to say this is continued in Dragon Warrior 7, and also Dragon Quest 8 since Ramier appears here, and then would also have to say Dragon Warrior 4 and Quest 5 and 6 because of Zenith Castle, and that leads to Monsters 1 and 2 and 3 and... okay, never mind. Let's just say the story continues here in Dragon Warrior 1 and 2 and call it a day. You'd think that's the ending, but no it isn't, we have post-game. And it's part of why that list of games I mentioned earlier went on so long. So above the Dragon Queen's castle, we have the Sky World dungeon, which leads to Zenith Castle. This will become a place of great import, with the trilogy directly succeeding this. So for some reason they tried to link Dragon Quest 3 to 4 through 6, likely as a cute cameo, since the Super Famicom remake that added this came out after those games. This isn't meant to be taken too literally, though it hasn't stopped people speculating way too much about the timeline of all this. This was just fan service for the Zenithian trilogy on the Famicom and Super Famicom, though it being here for the Game Boy Color release also helps serve as great advertising for the upcoming 2002 PlayStation release of Dragon Warrior 4 and never mind, I made myself sad. The dungeon ends with a super boss that requires lots of grinding to even attempt. The Vinegon is a spectacular dragon. In the original script I called him a grand one, but I thankfully changed that because that's not a good adjective to use for dragon. Once we defeat this boy, which is no easy task, we're given the ability to make a wish. And it's here with this post-game, where we can finally revive our father, which concludes the entire story perfectly. The opening cutscene saw Ortega leave Alihan to defeat the Great Evil, and this final note sees him back there celebrating with his family, knowing the evils of the world have been defeated. But why would I waste a wish on that? It doesn't even do anything important gameplay-wise. I'm gonna use the wish to open up a post-game dungeon that is exclusive to the Game Boy Color release, and it's not in any of the future remakes or the Super Famicom version. Like I said, it's exclusive to this version. Sorry Dad, I'm getting a new dungeon. You can come back and defeat the boss again for another wish, though it requires you kill him in a much stricter number of turns to be granted that wish. I'm sorry Ortega, I'm using this wish on rare monster medals. Take that, Closure, I have more shiny things. These two wishes I made go hand in hand, because this is the most defining part of the Game Boy Color remake. The monster medals. The dreaded goddamn monster medals. On the surface, these are a really cute addition. Sometimes after defeating an enemy, you're granted a medal, and these start at bronze and can then become silver or gold, which are increasingly rare. Though even if you're eligible for gold, you can still get bronze ones. It's not like you're locked out of the earlier versions. This is all luck of the draw, and the odds are really against you. In a single playthrough, you'll never come close to getting even a bronze of every common monster, and the unique boss fights also get medals too, though thankfully you can refight these in post-game, so they're not unavailable to you if luck wasn't on your side that first time. On their own, these are really cool bragging rights. It's a fun digital collection of tokens, and they're fungible because not only will you get duplicates, you can trade these with your friends or anyone else you know with a copy of this game and a link cable. Once again, this is a great idea, and working with friends to fill out this collection of monster medals only makes it better. Now let's get to the problem. The less awful one is that having a thief in your team actually lessens your chance to get a medal, since their automatic action of looting treasures at the end of battle overrides any chance you have of getting a medal, since you can't get both in the same battle. It's not entirely a deal breaker, though remember, for American players this was the only way they could get a thief in Dragon Warrior 3 at the time. This was such an exciting thing, and you can't use it if you want to not be undermined by the game's other feature. But the real reason people hate these medals is because of that post-game dungeon that you use a wish on. If you want to actually go inside the dungeon, you need 150 monster medals. So no, I won't be doing this post-game dungeon that I used a wish on. But look, I can walk around the lobby of it. Cool, it's a freezing theme. I love that. But no, I'm not going in. These monster medals are saved to the cartridge and not a save file, so a family using all 3 saves would be in better luck, as would anyone who replays the same cartridge over the years. Even wiping a save file won't erase the monster medals. There's a whole other menu action that no one should ever click on if you ever want to erase them all. Other than the unfortunate blemish of all these monster medals and their execution, I adore Dragon Warrior 3 on Game Boy Color. I do feel like the definitive version of this game is still the Super Famicom release. It is basically this Game Boy Color release without any other compromises. After that, it's a bit more difficult. The next best version becomes harder to determine and will vary from person to person. We have the Switch version, which is mechanically an improvement over this and has a much larger screen size, so it'll be a lot easier to navigate. But it also lacks a lot of the charm of this, like the opening cutscene, or all that animation that we saw in battle, or even just a strong unified art style, since the Switch version isn't what I'd call the best looking release. This isn't in relation to the HD 2D version, which still isn't out at the time of writing, but I'm sure everyone in the future or call that the definitive version unless they personally hate that art style. But for me, if I was to choose a second best version of Dragon Quest III, I would still pick the Game Boy Color version in a heartbeat. Act surprised. But for you normal people, I don't see any reason why you'd want to play this. The Super Famicom basically does everything this version does but better, and the Switch version is readily available for the kinds of people who want to easily and legally play games. So yeah, this Game Boy Color version's a really weird footnote in the grand scheme of things. Almost everything it does is done better elsewhere, the screen size is a detriment from playing it, and most people who don't want to play the best version of something will go for the first version of it just for the sake of history. This does nothing worthwhile outside a dungeon almost no one will see. But it did fix the exploits in the Baramos fight, so yeah, this is still the best version to me. And speaking of best versions, the next video I'll be looking at is Digimon World Redigitized, and its much better 3DS release, Digimon World Redigitized Decode. You really only need to play one of these, and if you're gonna play either of them you may as well do the enhanced version, but I played both from start to finish because I'm weird. To me, this is the best Digimon game, and the second best Digimon game. Look, I love both these releases.